Well, thank you, Eric. That was a very nice introduction before. Travis, that was a terrific job. A long time ago, I was told that the best way to start a speech or a talk is either with a joke or with some kind of a hook. Well, I couldn't think of any appropriate types of jokes, and I really had trouble with a hook, but I'm going to try with a hook anyway. So, this is my hook. And what is that? It's sort of the title of my program, seemingly the same but not. Some routes, trails, conditions, the same route, trails, conditions, but uniquely different. I can't even read my own writing up here. Focus and experience, organization. Good. Now, what do we have underneath that? We've got two photos, or two paintings, or two drawings, however you want, two illustrations, I guess. And what are they? Well, I hope you can see them, and it sort of looks like the same thing, I think. Pretty much the same anyway. The one on the left, the gray one, looks like a storm, lightning. The one on the right, the one that's sort of in a brownish tone, it's pretty much the same thing. So what we've got here is something that looks pretty much the same, I would say. We've got a big rain and hailstorm out on the trail. It's hit two wagon trains. One's up on the top of a butte and one's down on the bottom, it looks like. My question to you is, which one is the Mormon trail? Which one? One on the left or the one on the right? So hopefully we'll answer that. And I think you'll be surprised at the answer, or at least the answer that I'll give to you. I first became interested in and acquainted with the Mormon Trail and the immigrant spirits after I had written books on the Oregon and California Trail. I noticed that the trails overlapped a lot, and it seemed like a natural progression just to go from the Oregon Trail then to the California Trail. Now it's time to write about the Mormon Trail. However, I was a little hesitant about that, and sort of like a chicken, I guess you could say at the time, because I was pretty young too. And I figured I just don't know enough about the Mormon church and the faith to really write about it, because I knew they were intertwined. However, we did have some very good friends who happened to be Mormons, and they encouraged me to take, and they noted the fact that my ignorance, I'll use the word my ignorance, or my inexperience, my lack of knowledge, could prove to be an asset instead of a detriment. And I thought about that for a while, and now I think of my deceased friend, George Ivory. He was right. I decided to write about it. And I learned a lot of things. But I also learned how much I did not know about the trails. And to me, that is an extremely important thing. There's so much to learn about trails that it's just hard to become an expert. And I do not consider myself to be an expert. You had a bunch of experts up here today talking in detail about some of the programs, and they know their history. At least that's my opinion. And I'm really happy that I was here to hear many of the programs so far, and look forward to more tomorrow. Well, first we'll give a little background information on the trails, because the topic is sort of a comparison of the trails, the Mormon experience with the Oregon and California Trail, and the experiences. because it's something that happens that makes them different and makes the Mormon experience unique. But this chart is about the people who went to Oregon, California, and Utah. It's based on the historian John Unruh's work between 1840 to 1860 and the number of people who went there. So if we take a look at that, in 1840, we see our first immigrants leaving, and they're going to Oregon, not to California, not to Utah. The next group, we see pretty much the same thing. More people are going to Oregon, few more to California, but nobody's coming here to Oregon, to Utah yet. Next time, same thing. Look at that. Just a lot more interest in California and in Oregon. But then what we have in 1847-48, we sort of see a big change. Utah shows a dramatic increase, but still more people going to Oregon and fewer people going to California. By 49, we see a dramatic increase. Something must be happening at these times. It's, what is it, 150,000 or something like that, people going to California. Something happened that really ballooned. It's just that, like, something must have happened in 47 and 48 to bring all the people out here to Utah. And then the final period, California is still first, but Utah is second, and Oregon is third. Now, I think probably most of you are aware of some of the things that happened that probably account for these changes. But we are going to take a look at some of them as we go through. How did they get to those places? Well, it's pretty simple. They took the Oregon, the California, and Mormon trails. That's what people say. Of course, it wasn't that simple. The trails might not have existed at that time, or at least exist the way people think about it. As far as the Oregon Trail, most people think of Independence as the jumping off place, and I think it probably was. They stayed on the southwest out of Independence. They followed the Santa Fe Trail. Then they cut a little west-northwest over the Kaw River up over to follow the Sublette Trace up to the Platte River. Staying on the south side of the Platte River, they went west, then on the south side of the North Platte, crossed Wyoming. They went through the South Pass down to Fort Bridger, then headed northwest up towards where Fort Hall ultimately is, west along the Snake, once again northwest up to where the Whitman Mission was, and west along the Columbia, and finally to Oregon City and to Fort Vancouver. The California Trail followed the Oregon Trail, at least at the beginning. The first wagon company, the Bidwell-Bartleson party, left Independence. They followed the Oregon Trail all the way out into Soda Springs, where they cut off, deciding to go down to California. They went southwest around the lake, down the Humboldt or Marys River, across the deserts, over the mountains, and finally into California. However, they did not take any wagons across the Sierra, so we don't have a wagon route over there yet. In 1844, the Truckee Trail route was broken by a wagon company, was called the Stevens, Townsend, and Murphy party. They had started in Council Bluffs. In 1846, the famous Reed Donner party left from Independence, and when they got out to Fort Bridger, they followed Hastings' advice cut southwest over the Wasatch Mountains into Emigration Canyon, down it, and then they got stuck just before they got into the valley. And they had to climb over a hill, which today we know is Donner Hill, on that. From there, they crossed the desert, and most of the rest of the history about them, I think all of us are familiar with. In 1848, a group of Mormons, some of whom had gone in 1846 to California by ship, and others who had come there with the Mormon battalion, were called back to Salt Lake by Brigham Young. So they were going east, and they cut a route over the Sierra and over to the Carson River and along it, and this opened up a second route into California, the Carson route. So we had the Truckee route and the Carson route were the major ones at that time. What we know today as the Mormon Trail, we've already talked about, and you've had a lot of programs on, so I won't go into too much detail on it, but it begins in Nauvoo, comes up into this area of the winter quarters, and then heads west along the Platte River. And it basically, as was mentioned also earlier, followed a lot of the other trails that were in this area that had been opened up much earlier by the Indians and the traders and the trappers and others who were going west of California to Oregon. When the Mormon company got to Fort Bridger, they also followed the Hastings cutoff, the one that had been cut by the Donner Reed Party. And they got down to Emigration over the Wasatch and down into the Emigration Canyon. But when they got to the place that had been a roadblock to the Donner Reed Party, they were able to successfully cut their way through the area. And this is a painting called the Great Salt Lake Valley that shows the view into the valley. And William Clayton, who you've heard of in the other talks, wrote down in his diary, he said, while the brethren were cutting the road, and I'll say, quote, around Donner Hill, I followed the old one to the top of the hill, and upon arriving there, was much cheered by the handsome view of the Great Salt Lake. I sat down to contemplate and view the surrounding scenery. There is an extensive and beautiful level-looking valley from here to the lake, which I should judge from the numerous deep green patches must be fertile and rich. So that's the view that we had from Donner Hill. And this is a painting showing the wagon company going around Donner Hill into the Salt Lake Valley. Many of you are familiar with Christensen's paintings on this. And this is a view today, or a few years ago anyway, from the top of Donner Hill. And you can see where the road is, and that's more or less where the trail came down into the Salt Lake Valley. And this section, as far as I'm concerned, in one sense, is the true Mormon Trail. This was the Mormons' real contribution to the route into the valley on that. Well, I thought, since I was supposed to be talking about the similarities, so we should talk about some of the conditions that were encountered. So if you were to read a bunch of the journals and diaries about the specific trail conditions, you'd note that they vary from year to year, even from trail to trail. But all the immigrants, it seems, no matter which trail they were on or which year, all had some of the same types of experiences and faced some of the same conditions. This, of course, is the prairie storm that I was talking about. And I don't know, did anybody figure out which one was the Mormon Trail? Like I said, I'll tell you the answer, and I'll tell you the why.
It's this one.
This one?
Because William Jackson went on the same trail in 1866.
See, I told you, there's a lot of smart people here. That's right, that's the Mormon one. Now, there's another way you could do it. And if you read his diary, he says it's a Mormon one. So, you know, there was nothing that I could tell when I looked at the paintings what it would be, except that little extra knowledge that some of you have. So that's the Mormon trade on that. So the storms were horrendous, and they were written about. I live in New York. You just don't have any storms like you have on the prairie in New York. They're just very different on that. There are, of course, that's our other one. Another problem was dust on the trail, and we have a quote by Charles Smith, who recorded, "Our road is very dusty. The dust is so light that the least wind raises it. Sometimes the dust is so heavy we cannot see the wagon immediately ahead of us in the train." And that caused the companies to get strung out on the trail. And the same is true today. This was, I was following a car as we were driving along the trail. And you can't see the guy, and he's way in front of us. So you can still experience a lot of the things that they did. But there were river crossings, fear of drowning. Other times there was a lack of food, not having sufficient water, lack of forage for the stock, not enough fuel for campfires, running out of food. There was fear about the Indians and what was going to happen. They had wagon breakdowns. There were accidents. And of course, the monotony of the daily routine of the trail and the psychological impact. And of course, there's one other thing that happened, and that was the fear of disease and the dreaded cholera, and then ultimate death. And this is Rebecca Winter's grave. She is a Mormon who died just a couple days more than 170 years ago. She died on August 15th, 1852. Now, her grave has since been moved a little, but if you were to go out and see where it was moved, it would look almost the same, so you can't even tell in a sense that it was moved. On the other hand, there was a beauty that was found and experienced along the trail. Doesn't make any difference, once again, whether you're Mormon or non-Mormon. They all commented about the flowers, the wonderful scenery, the first sightings of buffalo, the landmarks that they saw, the marriages and births that took place, and then finally the joy with the arrival at their destination, just like Clayton experienced when he got up on the top of the Donner Hill and wrote about what he thought and how he felt at seeing the Salt Lake. Well, let's talk about some of those things. Why did they go? Where did they go? How did they go? What were the routes and vehicles that they were? First, why did we go? There's a phrase that is used, it's kind of simple, I guess you could say, but it's glory, gold, and God. And that's been used to explain why people went west. Those who went to Oregon and California were going for a variety of reasons. Glory may apply to the many of the younger men who sought adventure and new experience. Maybe it was a way to prove who they were. The federal government sponsored numerous expeditions to explore and survey the lands of the West, which had been recently acquired. And many of those people became famous. We've all heard about Lewis and Clark. We all heard in an earlier talk about John Charles Fremont and his maps and how important they became. Also mentioned, I think, with the long surveys and maybe the Pikes, but all of those people became household words. Everybody knew who Lewis and Clark was, who John Fremont was. A Better Life was an economic goal. In a sense, it's sort of like gold, not exactly, but sort of like it. It was the major motivation for most of the people. Stories about free land and fertile lands had a great appeal to Americans who at that time were mostly farmers. And also the poor economic conditions, the bank failures and panics added to the interest in moving west. In 1848, we had the discovery of gold. And of course, that's that big balloon in population movement to California, that 151,000 people who went there in 49 after hearing about the gold on that. So there were all sorts of reasons why people went. This shows some of our religious leaders at the time that helped to open up the West. In 1831, a group of Nez Perce and Flathead Indians came back to St. Louis and wanted to find out about the white man's book about God and I would say, I guess, the Great Spirit, and learn something. And their inquiries led many of the newly reawakened religions to send missionaries out to the West. And these are some of the ones that went. Jason and Daniel Lee were Methodist missionaries. Samuel Parker, Marcus Whitman headed out to Oregon. In 1836, Whitman and Henry Spalding brought their wives, Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spalding, back with them to the Oregon Territory. And that's important because a lot of people didn't think women could go and they couldn't take wagons out there. Well, these two ladies were the first white women to, recorded anyway, that made it through the South Pass. They also took their wagon almost as far as they wanted. They got up to Fort Hall. They had to change the wagon into a cart and then continued on to Oregon. But it proved that women and children could go out and successfully make it there, make a home. Father Pierre de Smet was another man who helped spread religion, and he was a Catholic who had originally set up a mission in the Council Bluffs area, and then over the years became more associated, I think, with the farther west part. But all of these people helped bring religion out west, but it was primarily religion to the Indians, not so much for the, of course, the settlers did it, but it was the idea to Christianize the Indians, to bring them into the Christian fold, I guess you could say, on that. And then we had two others. We have Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and I don't think to go into the role that they had on this, but it's important to note that to many people, the Mormon Church was a different type of Christian religion, and Mormons became, within a very short time, persecuted for their some of their beliefs. And even though the church was started in New York, persecutions increased, and the church was moved. It was moved to Kirkland, Ohio. Temple was built there. However, persecution followed them. They moved to Independence and Far West, and persecution followed them. The famous extermination order of 1838 caused another move, and the church moved to Nauvoo, but persecution followed. In 1844, we already heard that founder Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed, and Brigham Young soon became the leader of the Mormon church. They came to the winter quarters here, and it was decided that they should move out to Utah and the Great Salt Lake Valley. And there they would build their New Zion, the Promised Land, where they would be able to be free from persecution, could prosper, where the saints could gather and worship as they saw fit. And in the spring of 1847, they continued, and the route left, used the Nauvoo, of course, before, and then continued from here all the way out into the Salt Lake, and that became the Mormon Pioneer National Historic Trail that was mentioned earlier. The route was used pretty consistently for most of the time. Leaving from the Council Bluffs area, it continued over the established routes, and it wasn't until following the established routes following the north side of the Platte, and it wasn't until in 1850 when the decision was made to move it down to a little south of here to the Bethlehem Ferry, and that year the trail followed the Oxbow route and then continued west, and then later on joined with the main trail. Then again, a few years later, in 1853 and 54, another site at Keokuk and Atchison was tried, and then we could jump all the way to 67 and 68 when Wyoming was used as the jumping off point. Now, in between that time, we also had the hand carts starting off from Iowa City, and that was for a few years, as was mentioned in one of the earlier talks. The hand carts were constructed in Iowa City, and the route went across pretty much a lot of the established trails or the roads, and then once it got to the Omaha area, they followed the regular route for most of the time on that. This was Council Bluffs, the winter quarters, and Florence and Painesville area. This was just a drawing of the Colville area where the hand carts were constructed. This is a map of the jumping off sites, and I put this there for a comparison because for the Mormons, they usually left from one major area that was decided upon, and like we've been talking about, and for a couple of years it turned out to be Wyoming. Before that it was Iowa City, and most of the time it's been the winter quarters, Florence area. But this is the California and Oregon trails, and there at least, I think there's something like 18 or 19 different sites that ultimately are used as a jumping off place for the non-Mormons. This, of course, did vary from year to year, But even during the same year, you had people leaving from a variety of places. So this is one of the major differences that I see is between the Mormon experience and the experience of the non-Mormons. Most Mormons tended to leave from a central area every year, whereas the people going to Oregon and California, they left from all over, wherever what was closest to them, what they could get to, and so on. This is the other end of the trail. For the Mormons, Salt Lake Valley, that was the goal. Now from there, it's true they spread out in the Great Basin, but the goal was in the Great Salt Lake Valley and ultimately Salt Lake City. But here, once again, you see a variety of destinations for those going to California. There was no one single California trail, in a sense. There were California trails, plural. And without going through them, again, there's 10, 11, 12, 13 places. And once again, people were going primarily here during the gold rush to wherever the gold was discovered, but they also stayed at some of the other places. So you had people going to more than one site on the California trails. In fact, on the California trail system, there were places where people going to one way were going, I'll just say, to the right, and people going to the other place on the same, quote, trail were going to the left. So they were passing each other, almost like one was going backwards on that. Now, what did they use? Well, all the immigrants on the Oregon-California trails, or almost everybody used what's called the prairie schooner. It was a farm-type wagon, smaller than the large Conestogas. They were constructed to carry about 2,000 pounds. They were about 8 to 10 feet long and about 42 inches wide. As a matter of fact, one of the church wagons in 1850, I've got a quote here, they also used this type of wagon, but they also used something else, which I had never seen until I read this. But then I think it made a lot of sense too. In 1850, the church wagon company captains noted, there are some wagons that are quite too heavy, but also wagons with a stiff tongue, which is unsuitable. And so I'll use the word decree, I'm not sure if that's proper, but they said, let no person hereafter buy a wagon for this trip unless it has a joint. Now that's in the tongue, so I think the tongue would go up and down. And light wagons that bear from 16 to 2,000 pounds, that's the type that I was describing before, are most suitable for this service. These heavy wagon or heavy numbered concerns should be left here. So basically, I think what they were saying is, this is the type of wagon that you're going to have to use. And if you want to use something else, you're not going to bring them. Leave them here. Well, we all know that oxen, mules, and horses were used as the draft animals, but the oxen were the most frequently used. We also know that Mormons used another vehicle, and that's the hand carts. And we've talked about that, you heard a lot about that, so I'm not going to go through too much on that. I do want to reiterate the point that I think was very well made, that the system was developed to reduce the cost of travel and to provide a system that would enable the poorer people to come. And this, I think, is one of the things that definitely distinguishes the Mormon Trail and the Mormon Trail experience. Hand carts were used, as mentioned, from 56 to 60, not all from the same place. My statistics differ a little. I had over 650 hand carts were used. A hand cart would hold about 500 pounds, which is about a quarter of what a wagon would. I had at least one estimate for the cost of a cart was only $10. Each saint was allowed to carry only 17 pounds of clothing, bedding, and utensils, and 5 people, were typically assigned to a cart. And we all know that they were pulled. And I'll just refer back to the talk a little earlier. It was terrific on that. Well, who traveled? How were they organized? Until 1847, the destination for most of the immigrants were to Oregon and California. The advertising focused on the farm families with the free land and so on, the rich fertile land, and the adventurous and the patriots. A manifest destiny all was talked about. But in 1847, the Mormons proclaimed that the destination was going to be the Salt Lake. So that made things a little different. Males dominated the society in both the non-Mormon and the Mormon communities. Males usually made the decisions of when and where to go. And for the immigrant going to Oregon and California, they were independently chosen. They decided when to go. They decided where to go. They decided which route to take. And they were free from any religious influence. While the church had a little more sway on the Mormons. Of course, when gold was and at the very beginning, families went with kids. With the discovery of gold, all of a sudden it was primarily males that went west to California and then to Colorado or Idaho or wherever the other discoveries were. And then starting in back by the mid-50s and 60s, it was families again that were going. Sometimes these were the hand carts, and we're going to jump up to this. Some of the wagon companies had agreements and a little constitution or a document that talked about what was expected of them, how it was organized, what its duties and powers were, who went. But they always almost included a way out. And they usually noted that decisions were made by voting. Well, that sounds very democratic. I'm sure it was, and sure it worked very well for some people. But it had the unfortunate effect also of, I think, causing the wagon companies to dissolve as they went along. The unfortunate truth is, I don't know of too many. In fact, I only knew of one wagon company that made it all the way there, but I really never studied it in depth. And that one, Goldsboro Bruff was on, and he got sick just shy of their destination, and he stayed behind. So I suppose I could say that not even his company, although the rest of the company went on and made it safely, he was left behind, and then later on did make it there. This is the document, the Word and the Will of the Lord, and this was given to Brigham Young. And I think the unique thing in this is it included instructions on how the Exodus would be organized, how the companies would be organized, what was expected. They talked about the companies of 150s, or captains for hundreds and 50s and 10s, what was expected of them, and what was expected to happen if they didn't follow what it was. The regular non-Mormon companies, like I said, were made up of individuals who had a vote. And it's also important to note that they were a group of strangers. And working with strangers is very difficult. And even if you start working with strangers, you started having problems on the trail as soon as you went. And so you were trying to work to become a unity and working well, but you had people with different ideas, and they were constantly in conflict with this. With the church companies, this was not the same type of experience that they had. Many of the saints that were in the new converts had come from Europe, and they had come over by ship, as already was talked about. They came over by train, as was mentioned. So they had experience learning who was with them, and they learned how to get along before they were sent out on the trail. Now, I'm sure they had problems. That happened. But they also had this working experience of living and working with some of the other strangers who were, by the time they got on the trail, were no longer really strangers. So there was a cohesiveness to the Mormon companies that I think was a major advantage to them when you were to look at and compare the regular or non-Mormon trains, whether it was a trains or a cart or what have you. And I think this is a really very important point to make. I'm going to try and move right along on some of this. Yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, that's what I just noticed that on that. I think we'll jump ahead, skip a number of things. One of the things that the Mormons did, and this was emphasized before, was they saw themselves as a group who was to help their fellow Mormons on the way. And whether they were Mormons that who were been established or whether they were a strange person, stranger from another culture, another country, they were Mormons. And you were expected to help your fellow man and your fellow Mormon. And I think this is one of the other important differences with the Mormon trains and the other trains. A lot of times on the regular trains, you would have somebody who would get rid of rocks on the road, but it was done primarily for themselves. Other people benefited from it, but they benefited. They also made ferries and bridges, but once again, they might even stay for a day or two and charge a fee for it. But once again, it was for them. They wanted the money. They made a little money for a day or two, and then they left. And the Mormons, however, established all sorts of things that were ways of helping their fellow Mormons. This is the Mormon mill. One of the first things they did when they got here was to construct a mill. Mills are important if you're going to live and have food and so on. So this was a very important thing. And I know you're going to hear about this, I think, in another program. So I think we'll not mention anything more about that either. We also had way stations that were built along the way. This is two of them at Garden Grove, excuse me, and then the sign that we just visited these on our way out here. So this is a new sign of the station at Genoa. And cabins were built, land was plowed, food was grown. All this was done not from a selfish interest, but from an interest of helping to provide those who were yet to come on this. Fort Supply was constructed in 1853 in Wyoming, near Fort Bridger. It acted as a counterbalance for Fort Bridger, and it helped provide help during the handcart disasters of 1846 that you've already heard about on that. This is a photo showing the remnants of part of Fort Supply. Most of you know, I think, or may not, the fort was during the Utah, or sometimes called the Mormon War. Brigham Young had Fort Supply burned, as a number of other places were destroyed during that time. And this is the remnants of the logs that have been forced up out of the soil over the years on that. And of course we had Genoa, which was only in existence for a couple of years, 56 and I think 7, and by 8, the area become part of the Pawnee Reservation. But Mormons did other things also. The ferries were built across the river. This is the Mormon ferry at a replica at Fort Casper on the North Platte. Another one was on the Green River. These were very dangerous, it could be very dangerous areas to cross, and fording was difficult, and so ferries were built there. Once again, they were built to make it easier for all the people to come across and those yet to come. Fees were charged, but this was a way for the church to get an income at that time. And these were more than a day or two. They were there during the season on that. Another program that was mentioned earlier, and I'll just mention it again, was the Perpetual Emigration Fund. And it was started in 1849 and incorporated in 1850. It lasted into the late 1880s. And once again, part of the aim was to help the poor get to Salt Lake, and they were expected to pay it back on that. Another program that you heard about were the down and back trails, and another one that was covered was the Clayton and the Emigrant Guide. This is another page. You already saw, I think, probably three other pages from it, so I'm not going to go through it again either. But the key here is this was a way of providing help for the future Mormons that were to come across the trail. And it was used by non-Mormons alike on that. And this, of course, is our roadometer, and I don't want to go through and repeat all those things over again either. This, of course, is not the original on that, but the guide and the concern and the immediate concern for the future Mormons who are yet to come, and that were expected to gather in the Great Salt Lake were there. And we'll skip that. And this, I'll end with this, is one of the pictures of the down and back companies. And without going through it in detail again, after you just heard a terrific program on it. This is, I like this one for personal reasons. I saw this when I was a young kid. That's like 70 years ago or so. I remember seeing this. And I just thought it was a neat picture. And as I got older, I saw it more and more and more and more. But it talked about it as a wagon train going west. And someplace it was talked about as one going into parts of Wyoming where I just couldn't even imagine it looking like that. And then, of course, it talked about it as in the Echo Canyon going west. But the truth is, 30 years ago, I found this area, and it is and ever since then, or almost ever since then, it's been accurately identified as a train going east. This was part of the down and back system on this. You can still go see this area if you want to hop the barbed wire fence and you want to forget about seeing the no trespassing signs. But this is the area today on that. Now it's eroded a little, but it's the same place. You can still see the trails where they came. One of the differences is it looks like it's at an angle. And the reason why the trail looks like it's at an angle, and the hills in the back and the formations, if you were to look for that angle, you wouldn't find it. Because the camera, this is a very soft area, as you can tell from the photo. This area, the camera probably sunk sideways. And so what you have is, this is the way it should look on that. So the trail comes, I don't know how Travis did this, but this is one of the trails. It must have been a high water trail. Most of it showed the wagons coming this way around here. The interstate comes right through this gap back here behind the trees. Now, I've been there since then, excuse me for that. The trees are grown up now, so you don't even see this formation anymore. It's all trees. So if you do go to look for it, it's there. Just have to look through the trees and you can see some of it. Well, I'll just stop with saying it's been a pleasure being here, a pleasure talking with you. All the factors that I mentioned helped make the Mormon experience different. And I'll just emphasize again, I think largely they were concerned with those who were yet to come. And I think that made their experience and their trail a little different than everybody else's. Thank you very much.